In this video, we're going to show you how to install Vector on a bike and get you up and ready to roll. So grab your Vector box and your two Vector 2 pedals. We like installing Vector with the bike in a stationary trainer. It holds it nice and stable. It gives you easy access to both the left side and the right side. So if you have access to a trainer, it's a good way to install Vector. So take your pedals and simply hand thread them into the cranks. With the Vector 2 pedal, you can go straight in and install it as you would any normal set of pedals. We also recommend you put a little grease on the threads of the spindles just to give you a good clean mechanical interface with the threads in the crank. So hand tighten them both, and then we're going to grab our torque wrench and tighten them down to spec. So with the torque wrench and the 15mm crowfoot tool that comes with Vector, go ahead and tighten them down. The spec is 25 foot-pounds or 40 Newton meters. Just hold the rear brake and allows you to go ahead and tighten that down to spec. Now do it on the left side. And we're to spec. Now, if you don't have access to a torque wrench, we often get the question, how tight is tight enough? You want to give it a good firm tightening if you're not using a torque wrench. Err on the side of tightening it a little harder than you think. If Vector is under-tightened, it could under-report power. If it's over-tightened, it's not going to have an effect on the power readings. So just give it a good firm tightening. You don't need to overly muscle it, but just give it a nice firm tightening. Okay, so we've got the pedals on. The next thing we recommend is to wipe the shoulders of the spindles. By the shoulder of the spindle, we mean this area where the wrench flats are, where you're tightening down. The reason is that the new pedal pod wraps around that spindle and is tightened down against that. If there's a lot of grease on that shoulder surface, then the pedal pod could rotate once tightened down. So use a clean rag, a little water, a little soap, or some isopropyl alcohol, and simply wipe them down. So once they're in place, go ahead and wipe them down. And now you're ready to install the pedal pod. One other thing is to make a note of your ANT ID. So the 5-digit ANT ID is laser printed onto the shoulder spindle of both the left and the right pedals. It's the same number, the same 5-digit number. The reason to take note of it is once you put your pedal pods on, they're wrapped around that shoulder and you won't be able to visibly inspect them and determine the ANT ID. This is helpful when you're pairing your edge to your pedals. You'll be able to validate what that ID is in case there are other power meters around. So let's take a pedal pod and go ahead and install it. Grab a pedal pod, one of the screws, and the 2.5mm hex wrench that was included with your box. Start on the left side and wrap that pedal pod around the shoulder. And then we recommend to go ahead and just snap the connector into the back of the spindle. That holds the pedal pod in place. You can take the screw, insert it into the pedal pod, and now tighten that down. Okay, and then tighten it down to a nice firm tightening. You'll sense the resistance. And ensure that the pedal pod is up flat against the crank as you tighten it down, just to make sure that it is nice and flush up against the crank. What you'll also start to see is the LEDs on the pod will start to blink as the pod is making a connection to the sensors inside the spindle. Next, we'll move over, grab the remaining pod and a screw, and move to the right side. Once again, wrap the pod around the spindle, connect the connector to the back of the spindle, insert the screw, and tighten it down. One of the advantages of the Vector 2 pod design, once again, is that you can make sure that the orientation is where you want it. It does not rotate as you tighten the pedal, for example. So you can make sure that it's nice and perpendicular to the crank face. Once again, when the crank is in the forward position, we recommend that the pod is facing down. So you do that on both the left side and the right side. Now that you've installed the right side, what you'll need to do is make sure you have enough clearance between this connector on the back of the crank and the chain when the chain is in the big chain ring and your smallest cog in the back. So put the chain in those positions and then just rotate the crank around to where it passes by the chain and make sure that you have enough clearance there. And in this case, we've got a couple millimeters, both at the upper and lower portion where it passes by. If that connector is too close to the chain or even making some contact with the chain, you can add a washer in between the pedal and the pedal spindle and the crank, and that'll pull that connector head in a little bit. In this case, we don't need a washer and the system is set to go. What you'll notice after a couple minutes, once the pods are installed, is they will make a connection to each other. So each pod will make a connection to its own pedal, and now the system will connect to each other. What you'll ultimately see is a 5 flash condition, where every 10 seconds the pods will flash 5 times. And what that means is the system is now ready to set the installation angles. The angles are not yet set. So turn your edge on and pair up your edge to your pedals. So depending upon the edge model that you have, you'll just go ahead and activate the power sensor, connect it to the pedals, note the 5-digit anti-D that you saw before on the spindle, and now you've got the edge connected to the pedals. On 510, 810, 1000 models, once you connect a vector, it'll tell you that you need to set your installation angles. And these angles are simply telling the system, now that you've tightened it down and you've got sensors inside the pedals, what is the orientation of those sensors to the crank arm so that it can determine the driving force and the non-driving force and use the driving force for the power calculation. So to set the angles, put a little resistance on your trainer. Simply tell the edge that you're ready to set angles, and go ahead and spin up. And you can do this in street shoes. And pedal up over 80 RPM, and after about 10 pedal strokes, the angles are set. The next prompt is to set your crank length. So go ahead and set your crank length. Now that is stored in the system. And the only time you need to reset those angles are if you take the pedals off, you move them to another bike, or you retorque your pedals. You'll want to go through that angle resetting process again. But once it's on the bike and you continue to ride, there's no reason to reset those. Once the angles have been set, you can be sure that the whole system is up and running properly by inspecting the LED. You should now get a single pulse every 10 seconds, and that means the system is all set to go. After a few pedal strokes, those LEDs go to sleep, or if the system lays dormant for a minute or two, those LEDs will go to sleep as well. So if you want to check the status, simply rotate the cranks, wake the system up, and you should see that single LED flash again. So there you have it. That's an installation on a bike to get you up and ready and up and running with Vector 2.